So today I want to talk about the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman. And I want to make an argument that I have been building toward for a long time in my analysis of the Middle East and the global economy. The argument is this: what the GCC built over the past 50 years was not an economy. It was a mirage, a spectacularly convincing, extraordinarily expensive, genuinely impressive mirage, but a mirage nonetheless. And what this war is doing, the conflict now engulfing the region, is not creating the GCC's economic problems. It is revealing them, stripping away the illusion layer by layer until what remains is the physical and economic reality that was always underneath. A desert, a hot, waterless, resource-poor desert that, without the very specific and temporary conditions created by petrodollar wealth, was never capable of sustaining the populations, the cities, or the economic ambitions that were built upon it. Let me start with geography, because geography is not optional. It is the foundation on which every economic model must ultimately rest. The Arabian Peninsula is one of the most physically inhospitable regions on Earth. Average summer temperatures exceed 40 degrees Celsius across most of the region. Annual rainfall averages less than 100 millimeters in most areas, less than 50 millimeters in many. There are no permanent rivers. There are no significant freshwater lakes. The region has among the lowest renewable freshwater resources per capita of any inhabited area on Earth. The soil, where it exists at all, is predominantly sand and gravel with limited agricultural potential, even under irrigation. Under these physical conditions, the natural carrying capacity of the Arabian Peninsula, the population it can sustain through its own agricultural production and natural water resources, is a small fraction of its current population. Before oil, the population of what is now Saudi Arabia was estimated at approximately 3 to 4 million people, living predominantly as nomadic pastoralists and coastal traders. Today, Saudi Arabia has a population of approximately 35 million. The UAE, which before oil had a population of perhaps 100,000 people, today has a population of approximately 10 million. These populations do not exist because the physical environment of the Arabian Peninsula became capable of sustaining them. They exist because petrodollar wealth created the artificial infrastructure to sustain them despite the physical environment. And if you are finding this analysis useful, please subscribe. I cover the structural economic realities beneath the geopolitical headlines every week, because understanding what is actually sustainable versus what is built on temporary conditions is the difference between sound economic analysis and comfortable fiction. Let me explain the three specific pillars on which the GCC Mirage was constructed. Each one is individually extraordinary. Together, they represent the most expensive and ambitious attempt in human history to overcome physical geography through financial means. The first pillar is water. The GCC has almost no natural fresh water. Its cities, its agriculture, and its industrial production depend overwhelmingly on desalination, the process of removing salt from seawater to produce fresh water. Saudi Arabia operates the world's largest network of desalination plants. The UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait are among the world's most heavily desalination-dependent nations. Desalination is extraordinarily energy-intensive. It requires large amounts of fossil fuel energy to process seawater into potable water. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are among the world's largest consumers of energy per capita, in significant part because of the energy demands of their desalination infrastructure. And desalination is expensive, producing water at costs that would make agriculture and most industrial processes completely unviable in any competitive global market. The GCC nations can afford desalination because they have oil revenues that subsidize the process massively, and because their energy costs are themselves subsidized by the same oil wealth. Remove the oil revenue subsidy, and the water supply of these cities becomes economically non-viable at the scale required to sustain their current populations. This is not a theoretical risk for some distant future. It is an arithmetic reality that exists right now and is masked only by the oil subsidy. The entire water supply of the GCC's urban populations depends on that subsidy. Without it, at current water prices, the cities cannot function. This is the most fundamental structural fragility of the Gulf model. You cannot have a city without water. And this water depends entirely on continued oil revenue. The second pillar is food. The GCC imports approximately 80 to 90% of its food. Saudi Arabia, despite having attempted to develop domestic wheat production using fossil aquifer water in the 1980s and 1990s, recognized that this was depleting irreplaceable underground water reserves and has systematically wound down domestic grain production. The UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait import essentially all of their food. This food import dependence was revealed in stark clarity during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, when global grain prices spiked and Gulf nations suddenly faced the full vulnerability of a food supply chain entirely dependent on stable global trade. Qatar, which imports over 90% of its food, saw grocery store shelves strain under supply disruptions that a self-sufficient agricultural nation would never have experienced. Saudi Arabia accelerated its investments in grain storage to build larger strategic reserves. The UAE intensified its diplomatic efforts to secure long-term food supply agreements with producing nations. All of these responses are rational, but they are all responses to the same underlying structural reality that this region cannot feed itself and must depend on the willingness and ability of other nations to sell it food continuously and without interruption. The GCC nations have also responded to this vulnerability by investing in agricultural land abroad, in Sudan, in Pakistan, in Ethiopia, in various other nations, acquiring farmland to grow food for export back to the Gulf. This offshore agricultural strategy is a further acknowledgement that the domestic physical environment cannot produce adequate food, and that sustaining these populations requires controlling agricultural resources elsewhere. It is economic colonialism driven not by ideology, but by survival arithmetic, and it reveals the fundamental fragility of the Gulf model. A region that must import the vast majority of its food through supply chains that can be disrupted by war, by sanctions, or by political decisions in other nations is not self-sustaining. It is dependent, and dependence is vulnerability. The third pillar is labor. The GCC's construction boom, its industrial development, its service economy, have all been built overwhelmingly on imported labor. In the UAE, foreign nationals constitute approximately 88 to 90% of the total population. In Qatar, the ratio is even higher, with foreign workers constituting over 85% of the population and an even higher share of the workforce. Saudi Arabia has a somewhat higher citizen share, but still depends heavily on expatriate labor across its economy. This foreign workforce built the cities, operates the hotels and restaurants and shopping malls, staffs the hospitals and schools, drives the taxis, and delivers the food. The GCC citizen population has been largely insulated from the labor market by government employment guarantees and subsidies funded by oil revenues. Nationals work predominantly in government positions and state-owned enterprises at salary levels that the private sector, competing in global markets, could not sustain. This model works when oil revenues are sufficient to fund both the government employment of nationals and the construction and maintenance of the infrastructure that employs the foreign workers. It becomes structurally stressed when oil revenues are disrupted or when the scale of the foreign workforce and its remittances back to home countries creates political pressures that force policy changes. The kafala system, the sponsorship arrangement through which most foreign workers in the Gulf are legally tied to their employers, has attracted significant international criticism and has begun to face reform pressure that the GCC governments are navigating carefully. Any meaningful reform of the labor arrangements that make the current model function, any increase in labor costs or labor rights that closes the gap between Gulf wages and global market rates, risks undermining the economic competitiveness that made the Gulf a destination for foreign investment and foreign businesses. And any reduction in the foreign workforce without a corresponding transition to citizen labor in the private sector creates a gap in economic functionality that oil revenues alone cannot fill. The foreign labor system is not a peripheral feature of the Gulf economic model. It is a load-bearing structural element, and the dependence on it is not decreasing. In most Gulf states, the ratio of foreign to national population has been stable or increasing for decades. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. The analysis I am building here explains why the conflict now spreading through the region is not just a military story. It is an economic story about the collision between a model built on temporary conditions and a physical reality that has not changed. Now let me explain what the war is actually doing to this mirage. The mirage of Gulf prosperity was built on three interlocking assumptions: that oil revenues would remain sufficient to fund the water, food, and labor infrastructure required to sustain these artificial cities, that the American military umbrella would provide the security environment in which the Gulf financial model could function, and that global confidence in Gulf stability would attract the capital, the tourism, the financial services business, and the talent that Dubai and other Gulf cities needed to position themselves as global hubs rather than mere oil revenue recycling centers. This war is destroying all three assumptions simultaneously. A Strait of Hormuz under threat disrupts the oil revenue flow itself. An American military commitment that looks increasingly costly and strategically uncertain undermines confidence in the security umbrella. And missile strikes on Gulf infrastructure, even limited ones, destroy the confidence and stability image that the entire hub economy positioning depends on. The GCC built itself on a mirage. And once a mirage is seen through, once the gap between the image and the underlying reality becomes visible, you cannot rebuild the illusion. You can rebuild infrastructure, you can rebuild buildings, but you cannot rebuild the confidence and the suspension of disbelief that made wealthy people and global businesses choose Dubai over Singapore, over Hong Kong, over London, over New York. That confidence is not a soft or intangible thing. It has a very precise economic value. It is the thing that justified the premium pricing of Dubai real estate. It is the thing that made multinational companies willing to pay the costs of establishing regional headquarters in a desert city rather than in Singapore or Zurich. It is the thing that made wealthy families from South Asia, from the Arab world, from Africa and Eastern Europe choose to park their capital in Dubai real estate and Dubai financial institutions rather than elsewhere. That confidence rests on one foundational belief: that the Gulf is a stable, secure, rules-based environment where capital is protected and commerce is predictable. The war is directly assaulting that belief, not destroying it instantly. Beliefs of this kind erode gradually, but each missile that lands near a Gulf city, each disruption to the Strait of Hormuz, each moment when the American security guarantee looks uncertain, takes another piece of that confidence. And once it is gone, the question that every wealthy resident, every multinational corporate tenant, every sovereign wealth fund investor asks is the same: is this actually safe? And the answer the war is providing is no, not reliably, not unconditionally. And in a world of alternatives, not reliably and not unconditionally is enough to make rational actors choose somewhere else. They will not announce it. They will simply not renew. Subscribe for more analysis of these structural economic realities explained clearly and plainly. And tell me in the comments, do you think the Gulf states can reinvent themselves economically before the oil era ends? Or is the structural challenge simply too large to overcome? See you next time.